Forge. Folding is purification and reinforcement with carbon add. Folding to distribute carbon. Chemistry. Hammer work with water and fire and carbon transform steel, removing impurities, avoiding steel from crack issues. Folding the steel is mandatory in order to lower the carbon content of the high carbon steel billet, homogenize the steel, reducing the number of slag inclusions and making them less harmful to the blade integrity. If the starting material is homogeneous enough, you don't need to fold the billet to create a stronger blade, so folding steel in terms of functionality doesn't make any sense with anything produced by a modern age blast furnace. Every time the steel is folded, it loses carbon. Said element is spread evenly across the billet and the slag inclusions are squeezed out from the material. When the steel billet is heated, it reacts with oxygen in the air and forms dark scales that are visible on the surface. It is extremely important that said scale won't end up in between the folded blocks. Those scales are rust, and having them in between the layers of the steel would be harmful for the blade structure. In fact, to avoid excessive carbon loss, the billet could be wrapped again with clay. It is fair to notice that it is almost impossible to prevent minimum amount of rust inside the layers. And each fold while removing inclusions, it also adds a little amount of harmful material. So while folding is extremely important at the beginning, after a certain level, it starts to be detrimental. The best number limit would be 2 times folded after it doesn't bring any strongness to the blade in manner of carbon distribution. Every time before performing a fold, the block needs to be heated at the right temperature, and due to the loss of carbon, it starts to be harder and harder to forge. This aids the smith to understand when it's time to end the process. After the process is over, high carbon steel billets have a carbon content of 0.7 to 0.8% of carbon in the steel. Medium carbon billets are about 0.5 to 0.6% of carbon in the steel, and the lowest carbon ones in between 0.1 to 0.3% of carbon in the steel. About half of the starting material is now gone due to forging. Once all the various billets of steel are ready, the smith has to start to make the blade itself. He wanted to create a monosteel sword. The process is quite easy because the only thing he has to do is take his billets and start to hammering it into a long and even bore. A much more complex and often ritualized process has to be done when the smith wanted to create a laminated sword, because he has to forge weld all the various steel, namely the core and the jacket, into a single piece and then start to hammer it. Forging the shape. Once that the billet is assembled and drawn into a long bar, the process of designing the blade starts. This is where the creativity of the smith and his personal choices arise, and everything in this process is related to his willing. Whether he wants to create a sword, a dagger, a spear, how much curvature he wanted to put in, which kind of geometry he wants to use, and so on. Extent of the steel for the shape, controlling hardness and softness of the steel by reducing carbon content. In this process, the tsunobe is about 90% of the final length and width of the blade, but is still much thicker. The shape is given through heating and hammering. The smith makes the tang and the tips as well during this stage. It is important that the blade would be as even as possible throughout his surface, and due to using only hand power, it requires a lot of skill. After the tsunobe is done, the smith starts to work on the edge. To do so, he heats the blade at 1100 degrees Celsius only at the edge and starts to hammer it to give the shape he desires. He also works on the ridge of the blade and on the back. This process is called hizukuri. After the forging and designing of the blade is completed, the smith grinds the blade in order to give an initial proper thickness to the edge. Quenching, yakiite, temporal blade, hardened process. At this point, much of the blade is finished because after the heat treatment, you cannot remove a lot of material. A mixture of clay and charcoal powder is painted into the blade's dual black back edge and the upper sides for making the hamon. The fast cooling down process of the clay on the edge will create martensite, so the carbon atoms will be stuck into the edge, instead of the sides and core and back of the blade with ferrite and perlite, letting the blade more flexible than the edge. The hamon of a blade is created during the quenching process called yakire. During the differential heat treatment, the clay coating on the back of the sword reduces the cooling speed of the red hot metal when it is plunged into the water, and allows the steel to turn into perlite, a soft structure consisting of cementite and ferrite laminations. On the other hand, the exposed edge cools very rapidly, changing into a phase called martensite, which is nearly as hard and brittle as glass. One of the key factors in Japanese bladesmithing is the selective hardening, also known as differential hardening. The hamon outlines the transition between the region of hardened martensite thick steel at the blade's edge and the softer perlitic steel at the center and back of the sword. This difference in hardness is the objective of the process. The apparently is purely a side effect. However, the aesthetical qualities of the hamon are quite valuable, not only as proof of the differential hardening treatment, but also in its artistic value, and the patterns can be quite complex. Charcoal powder, whetstone powder and earth tempering is carried out after dark to prevent outside light from penetrating. Raise the blade evenly to about 800 degrees Celsius and place it in water all at once to roast it. The side of the blade covered with a thick layer of soil cools slowly to avoiding burning. After hardening, the temper is checked, and if it's good, correct without any curvatures or deformations. We use sharpening stone to adjust the shape of the sword, checking for scratches. The edge cools very rapidly while the back and the sides cool slowly, since the stress applied varied. At first, a concave curvature appears, and then after a few seconds, the usual convex curvature appears and stays there. It is common misconception that the curvature of the blade is byproduct of the heat treating. However, the smith could choose to apply some degree of curvature, concave or convex, during the sunobe process, or even after the quenching is done in order to control the final shape. In fact, straight swords could be obtained even with this type of heat treating. The last element, the clay, on the blade making martensite, hamon, super hard edge. The hamon edge has martensite, very hard, hardened, the body and back has perlite, ferrite, more flexible, tempered, toughness. Hardness value in VHP for Japanese swords are the following: 650 to 800 VHP for the edge, 400 to 300 VHP for the sides, and 300 to 190 VHP for the core. But please keep in mind that value could change a lot. It is possible that the monosteel swords made in the 16th century in Japan had lower hardness at the edge.